Greetings, electric utility enthusiasts. My message in this opening statement is a simple one. It's that resource adequacy is not capacity. And so I say this is simple because this is something that everybody kind of recognizes, that you can't expect 100% output from every resource in times of system stress. So we do things to try to derate all resources down to their likely contributions. But I think in some ways it's not fully appreciated that they're not the same thing. So take the example of Texas, where the market reforms there have been under discussion since Winter Storm Uri. And by and large, I think that the conversation has been focused on encouraging more capacity to enter the system. But as many are quick to point out, the failures in the winter storm there weren't primarily a matter of lack of capacity. It was that the capacity that was there didn't perform to the expectations. So in other words, resources weren't adequate, even though the system had enough capacity, or at least it had close to enough capacity. So to really get on my soapbox here, a related mistake that people make is when they say that the failures in the winter storm aren't a market design issue. That's wrong, because the great virtue of the energy-only market in Texas is that it's directed pretty explicitly at the resource adequacy problem and not on capacity. So the energy-only model purported to solve the resource adequacy problem. So the fact that the resources weren't adequate means that it was necessarily a problem for market design. So what I think people might mean when they say it wasn't a market design issue is that it wasn't a capacity issue. And that's true, it wasn't a capacity issue, but that really brings me back to the point of this opening statement, which is that resource adequacy is not capacity. So I hope that sets us up for the conversation today.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin, for public power enthusiasts without and within. Roll on, enthusiasts, roll on. Roll on, enthusiasts, roll on. Roll on, enthusiasts, roll on. We're likely recruiting you to come and join on. Roll on, enthusiasts, roll on. We bring in some people way smarter than us, those in the industry with knowledge to trust. We know we aren't perfect, sometimes it's a bust, but we'll roll on, enthusiasts, roll on.
I'm Paul Dockery.
I'm Ahlmahz Negash.
And I'm Matthew Schroettnig, the Director of Operations and General Counsel for Northwest Requirements Utilities and this week's Public Power Underground Special Correspondent.
Joining Ahlmahz, Matt, and I as this week's celebrity guest star is Professor Jacob Mays. Jacob Mays is an assistant professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University. He is interested in applications of optimization and statistical learning in energy systems. His research focuses on the design and analysis of electricity markets. And one of my favorite interviews from Public Power Underground. Professor Mays, welcome back to Public Power Underground.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Is it okay if we call you Jacob?
Absolutely.
And one more follow-up. The last time we talked, there was a baby in the background, which was heartwarming and wonderful. But how old is that baby now? Is it crawling yet?
She's walking. She's now 13 months old. Yeah. So you might hear her, you might hear our 3-year-old. It depends, who knows what the future may hold.
Yes, who knows what the future might hold. So Matt and Ahlmahz are joining us as well. Matt, welcome back as well. I think it's been a bit since
you've been a minute. It has been a minute. I am very excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation, the ability to re-engage. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, happy to have you. Ahlmahz, are you full of questions? Are you as full of questions as I am?
Right out the gate. That opening was amazing, and I'm trying to hold back, but we're going to get through this. Questions on the way.
Professor comes out swinging. I like it.
Questions on the way. I hope you're ready, because we probably aren't going to be as polite to you as your students are.
Well, I can't give you guys grades, so.
Yes. On today's episode of Public Power Underground, we're approaching some electric utility and electric utility adjacent news from a market design professor's perspective. We'll talk resource adequacy market mechanisms, the Western Resource Adequacy Program as possibly the greatest RA program structure, and a New York Times piece about deregulation. We'll pose a hard question to Professor Mays with a new segment called Ahlmahz's Insightful Question of the Week, a segment I'm very excited about. And then we'll close out the episode by short-circuiting our way through the rest of the topics we didn't get to in a segment we call Short to Ground. But before we get started, a quick word from our presenting sponsor.
Energy Northwest is proud to provide clean, abundant, and reliable energy to help meet our growing needs. Energy Northwest is proudly advancing the Northwest's clean energy future.
I knew that.
Yeah, of course.
I knew that. They also have a great training program, which isn't in this promo, but I'll just provide it as a promo as well. They have a great internship program where college graduates can get an internship through Energy Northwest. I've talked about it many times on this podcast. I'm a big fan of that program. Wasn't in this ad read. They didn't write it in, but I'm just inserting it because I'm such a big fan.
All right. Well, sign up, boys and girls. Learn more about nuclear energy and its full potential at energy-northwest.com. That's energy-northwest.com.
Our first segment is Public Power Desktop, where we close out some browser tabs of energy and energy adjacent news. You've got the first story, Matt. Take it away.
Thanks, Paul. The last time you were on Public Power Underground, you provided a deep dive into a 2021 paper you co-authored with Jesse Jenkins on electricity markets under deep decarbonization. That was a fun one, and so thank you for that. The interview ended up spanning a host of articles and papers you've co-written, including private risk and social resilience in liberalized electricity markets, asymmetric risk and fuel neutrality in electricity capacity markets, and no discussion would be complete without mentioning the Frank Wollock paper on resource adequacy frameworks titled Economic and Political Constraints on the Demand Side of Electricity Industry Restructuring Processes. This time, we want to do a deep dive into a recent paper you co-authored with a Cornell PhD candidate, Han Xu, titled Beyond Capacity, Contractual Form and Electricity Reliability Obligations. The article's abstract summarizes its purpose as considering how the financial hedge embedded in alternative resource adequacy contract designs can induce different responses from risk-averse investors, with consequences for the resource mix and market structure. Before peppering you with follow-up questions, of which there are plenty, any framing or summary info you'd like to use to set the stage for our listeners?
Sure. So I kind of did it a little bit with the intro, but I think the one of the main points of the paper is that in the last 20 years or so, or since the restructuring of the electricity industry, we've kind of thought about resource adequacy as falling under three umbrellas. One is the traditional vertical integration. One is capacity markets or capacity requirements. And then the last is the energy-only model that was used in Texas. And so I think what we want to do in this paper is say, capacity markets are actually kind of a narrow way of thinking about the broader challenge of trying to share risk and facilitate efficient risk sharing between the demand side of the market and generators, suppliers of energy. And so we don't have to limit ourselves to capacity markets as instantiated today, but rather we should think about a broad spectrum of risk sharing, and then the paper thinks about how does the design of that those mechanisms for risk sharing affect which generators are able to participate and which companies are able to muster the financial wherewithal to actually commit to a capacity obligation. So that's kind of what we're trying to do in this paper.
Question about that the last sentence: commit to a capacity obligation or commit to a resource adequacy obligation?
It's an important clarification. You got me. So it's yes, a resource adequacy obligation. So generically, if you're a supplier of power, you agree to a contract that you're able to deliver a certain shape of power or whatever it is, how do we know that you're actually going to be able to follow through and deliver on that?
In the paper, you talk about the contractual mechanisms and thinking about the sale of the service almost like an option contract, where you're providing an option for energy during the times of scarcity, is kind of, I think, how you described it before. Can you talk a little bit more about how that works and making sure you aren't also getting the scarcity pricing, or should we be getting scarcity pricing even if we're selling in the option contract? Can you unpack that for me as someone who is not as smart as you?
Yeah, so in some sense that the premise of capacity markets, or like the reason why consumers should be interested in buying capacity in the first place, is because we think the revenues in the energy only market or the energy market won't be enough to sustain an efficient level of reliability. So if the scarcity prices were high enough, then there wouldn't really be any justification for a capacity payment, because generators should be getting paid enough to support their operation.
So the missing money problem, right? This is
the missing money problem. Yeah.
Okay.
So the theoretical justification for having a capacity market is that there's not enough revenue available in the energy market. So I think you can make it a somewhat separate justification, which we kind of do in this paper, is to say, even if you solve that problem, even if you have enough money in the energy market to support an efficient level of reliability in principle, it's not clear that generators are going to make that bet. And this is kind of what we talked about last time, where this is a really highly volatile product. The prices are really volatile in an energy only market, and so it's not clear that investors are going to put their money down and build generators on the basis of that volatility. And so there's an argument to be made that we should try to suppress or shift or somehow corral the volatility, just as a matter of making the market function a little bit better. And that's a little bit where the mandatory contracting idea of the paper comes in, is that there needs to be some sort of mechanism to facilitate risk sharing between the loads and the generators. And so capacity markets are one way of doing that, where we say, we'll suppress the energy prices, force the loads to buy something, and then that gives a little bit more security to the generators to make their investment, and then you facilitated a little bit of risk sharing in the form of the capacity market.
And is that risk sharing like a reduction for load responsible, for load serving entities? It's a reduction of your risk of scarcity pricing, and spreading that, what revenue you would get out of scarcity pricing, just spreading that over a longer time period, over a contract period.
Exactly. Yeah.
Am I thinking of it right?
Yeah. So from the load perspective and in a financial market sense, it's like kind of buying an option, where you have the right to power with a capped price. So the energy price is never going to go above some capped price, and then but you still know you're going to be able to get power. So you're not going to if everything goes according to the design of the capacity market, you're not going to be involuntarily curtailed. So you won't be subject to the rolling blackouts.
I wanted to follow up. Sorry, Matt. I just keep going. One of the areas you talk about in the paper is lessons learned from the European crisis, and that even if you have these capacity mechanisms, they may not offer the protections to consumers that you really want if you have like missing markets for the risk sharing. Can you talk a little bit about that lesson? And I fumbled that actual lesson. Can you kind of describe what lessons we learn on these capacity market mechanisms from what's going on in Europe?
Yeah. So one of the kind of interesting ways in which capacity markets are not like a financial contract and not like an option is that there's actually no financial position attached to it. So typically with a capacity market, you have an obligation to offer into the day ahead and real-time markets and like in the Eastern ISOs. But there's no specification on you have to offer at a particular value. So we're not telling the combined cycle plants, you have to offer at $50 a megawatt hour or $80 a megawatt hour. We're saying you just have to offer. So what that means is that load is still exposed to increases in the price of natural gas. So in the case of Europe, when natural gas increased by a factor of 10 or something like that, having capacity didn't really help them because there's no really financially binding aspect to the offers that had been made. So the spot prices went through the roof. So I think if you believe that consumers and retailers are fully capable of hedging by themselves and signing long-term contracts, then that's fine. But I think the fact that first off, I'm not sure anybody foresaw a price increase of this magnitude. And then second, there's so much capacity for political influence and saying, here, we're going to claw back these windfall profits, or we're going to intervene, or Uniper is going to declare bankruptcy, or EDF is going to declare bankruptcy and discharge their contracted obligations. There's so much room for that to just be messed up that it's not much of a it doesn't provide that much security. So I think how that plays out for end use customers in Europe is that depending on the structure of their retail market and how thoroughly they're hedged, they could see really substantial increases in cost in a very short span of time, which is just a political non-starter, which then flows back into the viability of the market regime, which is why political leaders across Europe are saying we need to end electricity markets and go back to something completely different. And I don't know where they're going with that because I don't think they've completely theorized that. But the upshot of it is that we shouldn't expect the normal hedging operations to work well in a situation like that.
I have one last question. I think I'm taking you back a little bit to your opening statement, though, about the difference between resource adequacy and capacity, then what happened with Winter Uri in Texas. And you mentioned that it's wrong to say that that's not a market design issue. Do you think that a change in market design would have prevented the outcome that happened during Winter Uri? Like a market design change itself was sufficient?
I think probably not. And so I think it's a complicated question because I think, obviously we've had this debate on, would a capacity market have helped? And I think probably the answer is if we had a capacity market that was designed the same way as PJM's or ISO New England's, it probably wouldn't have helped. And the reason why is because the performance penalties or the non-performance penalties in those capacity markets is very light. So it's much lighter than the direct incentive provided by the energy only market, where they said, if you can produce energy at this time, we'll give you $9,000 a megawatt hour. So that's a strong incentive, but obviously wasn't enough to solve the problem. So if you translate that to PJM, where the penalties are something like 3,000, in the range of 3,000, and then the prices would also be in the $2,000 or $3,000 range in that type of event, that's actually a weaker incentive. So you have to make a different argument about the risk and the fact that the generators are paying a penalty instead of just losing out on high prices, and that's a different sort of argument. So maybe I should just kind of elaborate on the resource adequacy versus capacity bit, because I think one of when I said that the energy only market purports to solve the resource adequacy problem, is with the capacity market, typically there's a lot of thought that goes into, here's the particular event that we're trying to plan for. So there's a summer peak event. We're planning to that peak, or maybe it's a peak net load, but there's a couple days in August that we're worried about, and we're kind of planning to that. And with The energy only market design, it's completely agnostic to what the event is. So if it's a winter storm, if it's a summer, hot day, if it's for some reason randomly in May, there's no wind and things get into trouble. The energy only design is agnostic to that because it will just put the prices at $9,000 and leave it to the market participants to place their bets on which of those is going to be the most important. Whereas the capacity market has a little bit more top-down architecture in terms of this is the particular thing that we're trying to plan for.
Got it.
With respect to your earlier point about bankruptcies, I'm curious as to your thoughts. Is there a penalty or a non-performance penalty high enough with the existence of the bankruptcy hedge to force performance in times of actual scarcity? And if not, how do we solve that problem?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough one because I'm not sure that any existing structure really handles that because, like you said, given how extraordinarily valuable electricity is and electric reliability is, you would need to set a really high price to get the theoretically correct incentive to do that, and that pushes you into the problem of bankruptcy and tail risk, and so then the stronger you try to get in terms of people posting collateral and performance bonds to avoid the problem of bankruptcy, the more you foreclose on new competition and get into market power concerns. So I think that this is a little bit of a rock and hard place type of situation that I wish I had a better answer for now, but hopefully in a couple of years I'll be able to give you something a little bit better.
Well, I think the real question is why it wouldn't end with basically a return to pre-deregulation, where every retail utility was incentivized to own more than the generation that they needed in order to serve their peak load, in order to avoid that scarcity pricing and avoid the capacity penalties or even organized capacity market costs as we see in PJM altogether.
Yeah, right. And so I think that's one potential conclusion that you could argue for is that there's no way around socializing it somehow, and so we ought to socialize that risk and try to do it in an intelligent way. I think another route is the type of stuff that they talked about doing after the 2008 financial crisis, where you have a little bit a smarter design in terms of the central counterparty if they're in place to manage systemic risk and try to handle this. But I don't. I'm interested in pursuing that idea, but I don't think it's like on the table, so to speak, in the conversations I've seen.
Well, I want to pivot this conversation to talk about what's going on in the West and an application of a new development of a Western resource adequacy program. So up next, Ahlmahz, do you want to tee off that question?
All right, let's do it. There has been an industry-led development of a resource adequacy program in the West, organized by the Western Power Pool. In the paper, you discuss near complete markets as an example of the least interventionist approach used by the Australia's retailer reliability obligation. You describe an enhanced version of the model used by Australia, which would have a requirement for retailers to hold contracts sufficient to serve their load all the time without specifying the particular form of the contract. And there seems to be an analog to your enhanced version of Australia's retailer reliability obligation in the Western Resource Adequacy Program. The West Adequacy Program relies on decentralized contract subject to a centralized determination of the quality of different contracts and the total that must be held. So the question This probably could have gone in the unfair question because it's not really a question, but would you say that the Western Resource Adequacy Program is a great resource adequacy program or the greatest resource adequacy program? No option for any other answers, A or B.
It's a
Right.
trap.
So, well, I guess here's how I would think about it, and not being privy to the details of the conversations. I think that one big question with any resource adequacy program is what happens when something goes wrong, and so what are the penalties for non-performance, and are those strong enough to really be painful for the people that are providing capacity or providing resource adequacy. I'm sorry, I did it again. And so I think in the organized wholesale markets, it's kind of easy to go through the tariff language and figure out, all right, this is going to be the penalty, and well, I shouldn't say it's easy because there's lots of ways that generators can get out of it and stuff like that, but it's a little bit more straightforward, at least for me as an outsider, to look in and try to figure out what those penalties look like. And so I guess one question that would influence how great the Western Resource Adequacy program is how those penalties are calibrated. So I think the flip side of penalties is if you don't have strong enough penalties, you have to be really good at accrediting the resources to try to figure out in advance, hey, these are not going to fail, or at least statistically they're not going to fail, and so we'll be fine, and we won't have too many instances where things are going so wrong that we need to worry about the penalties. And so then it becomes a question of how good are your models, and how smart do you think you've been about the future of drought potential and the Colorado River Basin and the Pacific Northwest, and the way that will influence the hydro contribution and things like that are kind of difficult statistical and modeling challenges.
Would you say you're optimistic about the Western Resource Adequacy Program?
Well, since I think 10 minutes ago I was talking about how everything was irresolvable, and we have tremendous reliability challenges. So I guess I think this is probably a positive development because clearly in the West, and clearly in the context of moving to more wind and solar and decarbonizing, sharing across the footprint is essential, and so trying to be smarter about resource adequacy on a regional level is I think certainly a development to be optimistic about. I think I hesitate to be optimistic about whether it will actually guarantee reliability because of those issues with are the penalties big enough, and are we really smart enough at getting all the hydrological modeling and the statistical modeling and the weather modeling right.
Time will tell. Time will tell. Or the weather as well.
Or the weather will tell, right?
I'm curious on the mechanisms for pricing to make sure the penalties are high enough. So what, in your mind, are the right ways to structure a penalty pricing scheme so that they are structured to be high enough? So I think, man, I should know better. And we're going to have Sarah Edmonds on, the CEO of the Western Power Pool, next episode to talk a little bit more about this. And she'll correct me if I'm wrong. But I believe we have this forward showing penalty where if you don't show, and based on the metrics, that you have enough, it's like a 2x cone. So a cost of new entrants time 2 penalty, down to a monthly value, that kind of thing. So you have penalties for not showing up, as calculated. But then in the operations program, and remember, this isn't a market, it's just a program. In the operations program, if you're called on, you then have a penalty that's a multiple of the index values, the market traded values. And that seems like a decent way to make sure your penalties are high enough. But that schema, do you have thoughts on a pricing schema to make sure it gives enough or not?
And could I build on that a little bit? And
Please do.
either forces, an appropriate schema to either guarantee performance to the extent it's possible, recognizing stuff happens, or to incentivize new development as necessary.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know. And so in terms of the question of how it's actually worked, what the index is and what the multipliers are, and whether that's right. I think that there's some efforts in the academic literature to try to assess the value of lost load and try to model out, what people should be willing to pay. And in theory, you can tie that to the penalty value, because in the case of actual rolling blackouts, then you want to be charging generators at least that much. Whether we can get, a really defensible value for what that value of lost load is tough. My feeling is that because of the bankruptcy constraint that I mentioned earlier, no politically possible or no practically possible value would be high enough compared to the value of lost load. And so so I think kind of the higher you can go, the better is my feeling on that.
Would you call this like full strength prices and multiples of full strength prices? I guess the one thing that it solves for, if you use the value of lost load, is I think we talked about last time, the reliability externality, where you always, like a utility always has just shutting off load as a hedge against high market prices. So if you're valuing on the value of lost load, you're probably insulating against that. And then the bankruptcy backstop becomes the next thing you have to worry about. I'm still processing where we are in this conversation. So is that kind of what we were doing there?
Right. Well, I think one of the challenges is that the value of lost load is such a moving target. And you can do the studies in Texas that they landed on $9,000 for pre-Uri, the value that they would use. But then when you look at what happened in the actual event and the consequences of having a several day long outage, and you think, okay, well, there's probably actually more than that. And there's a difference between having a 30-minute outage versus a 3-day outage. And there's a difference between it happening in April and happening on the coldest day in February. So having that really well calibrated is something that is probably pretty tough to do.
Or if it happens to me or a hospital.
Right. And then there's this other, I think we've seen this show up again and again where, TVA just had its first rolling blackout in 90 years. And this is well beyond the 1 in 10 year standard. So this is, by a planning standard, you could say, what, stuff happens. This was that occasion where, they had they had to do the rolling blackouts, but once in 90 years isn't too bad, and it's actually much stronger than the reliability standard. So we just kind of got to live with that. But in practice, it's a big political issue. There's big there's going to be an investigation. There's going to be a board. There's going to be major issues because the blackouts happened. There ought to be obviously some understanding of what happened and how to prevent it and how to improve processes. But I think it's a political issue beyond that would seem to suggest that whatever we call the value of lost load, in practice, at the end of the day, the fact that people are going to get fired and there's going to be a big political issue whenever a rolling blackout happens means that the value of lost load is implicitly much higher than what you would get on a survey.
I think that goes without saying.
I agree. I've always struggled with that. When I was back east, it was a little bit different in that I would get a list of, various electricity suppliers that I got to choose from. Here in the Northwest, that's not the case. We've got, effectively local enforced monopolies. And so I am a captive customer. And if I were if I were subject to 1 in 10 year rolling blackouts, I would have a real problem with that. I think it comes with the territory. If you don't, if there is a lack of customer choice, the obligation on behalf of the supplier of something as essential as electricity, there needs to be a higher standard associated with it. There can't simply be a financial out, right? If markets are too high, you don't get to turn off the power for your customers.
Yeah, although I would say that if you do, you want to reimburse your customers.
Yeah,
which is
my mother used to say when I was growing up that a failure to plan on my part did not constitute an emergency on hers.
Right.
That's
nice.
kind of how I look at it.
Nice. I did want to follow up on one thing though, because retail choice doesn't, I don't think, solve this like issue.
No, I don't think it does either. The monopoly aspect was just another feather in the cap, I suppose. But yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think there is an issue that you don't actually get to select your desired level of reliability, which would be another way of resolving this. If you said, you know what, I can, there are programs for cycling air conditioners and things like that, but you can't actually say, you know, if the prices go above 9,000, cut me off. That's not a.
Well, in Texas, they had retail choice, but that impacted the price that you paid. That did not impact whether or not you were subject to blackouts.
Right.
I want to get back a little bit to some of the other lessons from your paper. One of the investigations you did, at least as I interpreted it, was trying to figure out the ways of contracting for adequacy. And you investigated the Frank Wolak standardized fixed price forward contract framework. You looked at the mandatory contracting and mandatory offering off of different resources. And one of the lessons I think I got out of it was trying to have a robust contracting frameworks where different resources can use their efficient tools for contracting to make sure things like variable resources were basically priced out of developing because they, you know, the price of them providing resource adequacy, if it's their obligation, made it unlikely that they would ultimately get developed. Can you talk a little bit about that element of the paper and the contracting, the flexibility of contracting, why that's valuable in these type of markets?
Yeah, so I think the idea there is that with any sort of contract between generators and well, anyone, but ultimately loads, there's this question of, you know, what form should that contract take? So if you talk to renewables developers, the ideal for them in terms of transferring risk is something like a unit contingent contract where they say, you know, if the wind is blowing and I'm producing, I'll sell you the power at this price. And if it's not, then I just won't sell you anything, but there's no financial hit. But you can have variants of that where if you have a proxy generation contract, then you might be the generator might hold some operating risk, where if they have a mechanical failure that's causing them to generate as opposed to lack of wind, they still bear some risk there. Or if they're selling a fixed shape where they say, you know, historically we kind of know what wind will produce on average, so we'll sell you that shape, then they still have a bunch of shape risk where they might not be able to match the output that they've sold you. And so one of the problems is generators in general ought to want to sell contracts that kind of conform to the shape that they're able to produce, so that they can kind of financially defend their position that they've contracted for. And so the idea in those different tests is to say, if you force generators with something like a capacity market to sell essentially a shape that they wouldn't naturally choose, then they're going to charge a risk premium because they're not going to want to commit to something that they can't actually deliver on. And so the kind of the idealized case is everybody gets to choose their own shape, because then they can figure out what's right for them and what's right for the customers and land on something that's mutually agreeable. And that's kind of the theoretically ideal case. But in resource adequacy constructs, what we're basically doing is specifying a specific shape. And then the question is, how well do resources or portfolios of resources conform to that shape? And and then who's in charge of constructing that portfolio. So
Can I
go ahead.
do an interpretation real quick, and
Yeah.
then you can keep going? So really the shape we're asking them to conform to is load shape, right? So how good is your resource in matching the shape of the load that we're trying to serve? Is that the shape? I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to do with the portfolio.
Right.
But
And
make
so
sure we have
there's a
adequate
couple ways of doing that. If you have retailers, if you have competitive retailers, then ultimately their job is to try to figure out what their customer shape is going to be, to do some predictions, do some procurement for enough power to try to match that shape, and then have the risk that they'll get it slightly wrong and have to do the balancing in the spot market. With something like the Frank Wolak proposal, the standardized fixed price forward contract that you mentioned earlier, the retailer's problem is solved because he defines a contract where we'll say, hey, we'll just figure out the shape of this contract ex post. So we'll see what people
ex post meaning
after the fact. So we'll see. Thank you. So we'll see what the loads actually consumed. We'll define the shape of the contract that way, and then go back to the generators or the portfolios of generators and say, did you manage to hit that? Did you manage to meet that, the load requirement? And if not, you have to buy at spot prices to balance the energy that you didn't deliver. So what that in effect does is that the retailer's problem is solved from a risk management perspective because they've bought this contract that mostly covers them. It doesn't 100% cover them, but it mostly covers them. And then the problem is on the supplier's side, how do they get a portfolio of generators that's capable of meeting that shape and also meeting that price? So the fact that you've sold forward at a certain price means that you need some resources that you don't want to be so exposed to gas prices that you can't meet your obligation in terms of the price, but you don't want to be exposed to renewables variability so much that you can't meet your shape. So then you need some combination of renewables and storage and hydro and potentially gas and whatever it is, depending on your renewables targets or your carbon-free targets, that's going to allow you to meet the shape, regardless of what the shape ends up being, but then also stay within the price that you've agreed to.
In the paper, you ran some numerical experiments, is what I read.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the term for it? To try to figure out how that type of construct would compare to some more diverse contracting mechanisms, I think, where you could have broader participations and not just that same contract. Can you talk about the portfolio approach where different generators can contract naturally and why that may be a better outcome for load in at least the tests you ran, the why there?
Yeah, well, I think so. This is kind of like just an outgrowth of optimization models, is that the more constraints you put on, the worse the outcome is going to be, and the more freedom you give it, the better the outcome is going to be. And the corollary is that the more freedom you give to market participants to figure out what's going to work for them, the better in principle the outcome is going to be. So I think like in a sense, the fact that we have a resource adequacy program at all is indicative of the fact that we don't completely trust that. So we're not going to completely leave it up to market participants. So we're going to have some intervention, and then the question becomes, how do we do that in a way that is going to solve what we're worried about, but then still leave enough freedom for people to do what's going to work the best for them.
Wouldn't that just be ERCOT with no price cap?
No, I don't think that'll work, because I think the frictions in contracting and the transaction costs and the asymmetric information and the bankruptcy risk and counterparty credit risk gets in the way of that, and then becomes a reliability issue.
So like ERCOT without price caps may help resolve the incomplete market missing money problem, maybe, but you still have the incomplete markets and risk, right? As you
Right.
find it, there's like these two parts issues. So an energy only market like Australia or ERCOT without price caps may help resolve the missing money problem, but it wouldn't. You're speaking to the incomplete markets and risk.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I want to get it back to the Western Resource Adequacy Program because I'll just pitch it as the greatest, or I think it's really well structured because one of the things it's doing is not putting constraints on those contract frameworks for how load responsible entities go procure their adequate portfolio, right? So it's not a mandatory contract type. We have a framework for how to credit across the types, and then a penalty structure. But how you fill that as a load responsible entity is up to the load responsible entity. So you have these degrees of freedom for different resources types. What do you like the pitch? You like the pitch? Is that a good way to do it?
Yeah, I like the pitch, and I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier on, what happens if something goes wrong? What are the penalties? And then how good are you at evaluating the value of the different contracts?
Okay. Well, those are I like, and now I have a mental model of the two tests I need to use on
I'm
resource
just curious.
adequacy markets. Go ahead, Ahlmahz.
I'm sorry to cut you off. Of those two, I guess, risks that we have to look out for, which one is the greatest risk? Is it not getting those capacity accreditations right, or the penalties not being severe enough? Which one of those stands to be the greatest risk for us?
Well, I guess it seems to me like it is a little bit of an either or, where the stronger the penalties are, the less reliant you need to be on the accreditation, because the companies themselves should be well incentivized to make sure they're only committing to something they can deliver. The weaker the penalties are, the more weight is placed on the administrative evaluation.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about those two, actually.
Okay. Well, we touched a little bit on restructuring back to a structured framework for electric utilities and wholesale contracting. So maybe that's a good segue into the next topic. Take it away, Matt.
Recent New York Times article titled, "Why are energy prices so high? Some experts blame deregulation," made the rounds on energy Twitter to start the new year. In the piece, the author Ivan Penn frames the topic as the subject of quote unquote intense debate among academics, analysts, regulators, and utility industry executives, with some arguing that the regional approaches to electricity are essential to fighting climate change by, quote, making it easier for lots of companies to build wind and solar farms and connect them to the grid. I don't like that part. I took particular issue with that part. I'd like to hear Jacob's thoughts on interregional transmission planning with respect to decarbonization, frankly, and why that is so much better than what we talked about earlier with respect to the monopoly approach. The idea that overlapping utility service territories or RTO, ISO, et cetera, are going to do better when they are planning or employing centralized planning, I think I should say.
Yeah, so I guess that I think that well, kind of starting with the New York Times piece, one of the big issues is defining what deregulation means, or I think as obviously many people have said we shouldn't call it deregulation. That's just a different form of regulation. But I think one of the big problems is that there's really three main components of restructuring that are a little bit orthogonal to each other. One is having a transmission system operator that is independent of the transmission owners, and this is what allows regionalization and efficient dispatch across large areas. And I think the academic literature on that is kind of a slam dunk. Like it's very clear that that's provided operational benefits and reduced costs in operating. Second component of restructuring is separating generation ownership from transmission ownership. And I think that there's really no clear evidence either way. There's some, there's certainly some theoretical reasons why you want to separate them, but empirically, not, it's not obvious that has provided or made a big difference either way. And then retail competition is the kind of the third aspect of restructuring, where first off, no state has really accomplished it apart from Texas, and so I'm not sure you could find any academic who would say it's been it's been a real success, and so there's no real answer there. So I think that the one of the interesting findings that is, we're 20-ish years after restructuring, and more or less there doesn't seem to be much of a difference in retail rates and the way retail rates have changed between the different states depending on the different routes they took at that time. There's very clear impacts on prices that come from natural gas and the varying dependence on natural gas that the different regions have. And then there's very clear on impacts from state policy. So California has really high rates because of the state policies they've pursued. The Northeast has pretty high rates, tied with being disconnected from the pipeline system, or being really loosely connected from the pipeline system. But those are probably stronger factors than the restructuring, and it's a little bit unsatisfying. But it seems like we went through all this effort, and the retail rates, it didn't have a major impact.
We're going to talk Northeast. Should we get into the Jones Act, or is that a little?
Is the Jones? I didn't know the Jones Act was on the table, but I think coming back to your point at the end of the question, if we want to run a system on lots of solar and wind, the regionalization is the efficiencies from that are even larger, and so transmission planning and operations being done over larger geographic regions. Like I said, that's the one where from the academic literature, it's a slam dunk. And it seems like that the benefits from that grow with increasing solar and wind.
So if I'm underscoring this, the Northwest is looking at, moving from a bilateral market to a centrally dispatched organized market. And if I'm underscoring your point there, that would be the first category you talked about, which was quote unquote a slam dunk. Is that am I interpreting you right? That's the restructuring from the academic literature that's a slam dunk. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, you can quote me on saying regional planning and dispatch. It's the way to go.
So we just found our episode title.
I'm sorry. Before the slam dunk, is that including the issue, the whole capacity, missing money issues like that, going from bilateral to a centralized market is a slam dunk, even given the issues with capacity markets?
Yeah. So I think that I actually think of the capacity markets as one of the reasons why the wholesale savings have not flowed into the retail rates. If you look at PJM, it seems very clear to me that customers in PJM have overpaid in the capacity market for the last 16 years since RPM was introduced. And so despite the efficiencies in operations, there's this kind of overpayment baked in through the capacity market. So I think operationally it's still a benefit, and the costs are overall lower to operate the system, and I think that will grow with more wind and solar. But then the effect on retail rates is somewhat muted.
Right.
Need to balance the carrot and the stick, in other words, to keep with the baseball metaphor.
Is that a baseball metaphor?
I don't know. I was envisioning a baseball bat when I said stick. So for my brain,
Okay.
it was.
That's all the scripted topics we have this week, but we have a new segment I'm calling Ahlmahz's Insightful Question of the Week, because she's been asking our guests some great questions. She was calling them unfair, but really they just turned out to be incredibly insightful, if unfiltered and unscripted. So take it away, Ahlmahz, your insightful question of the week.
Oh, and I think it dovetails perfectly with this last topic. But is it fair to say, Jacob, that you are pro markets?
Oh, that is unfair.
By the way, that's not even the question, but I wanted to premise it. But yeah, let's go ahead and start with that one.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair to say that I have a market orientation. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think as came out earlier, I'm kind of pretty aware of the limits of markets, and I kind of view markets as a tool to get the regulatory ends that we're aiming for, rather than a good in and of themselves. So maybe that's one distinction.
Okay. Well, so just to put it out there, I wouldn't call myself anti-markets, but I would not say that I fall into the category of pro-markets. And I also don't believe, so like when Matt asked the question previously, and he just mentioned, what's to stop utilities from reverting back to pre-deregulation behavior, right? My ears popped up because I have that same question as well. But for me, I feel like the whole reason why restructuring is promoted is because it's believed to lower costs. That's like the fundamental. We want to have markets and everything because we want to increase efficiencies and lower costs. That's what competition is supposed to do. But I wonder if that is what our objective should be in supplying something as essential as electricity. If lower costs really is what we should be going for, but that's another topic for another day. My question to you is, so if you have like full markets or something like we have with the RAP, which is kind of what you call the near complete, I think is what you refer to that type of a program. Between those two types of structures, which one do you think is most likely to result in A, lower costs for consumers, and B, which one is most likely to justly allocate costs across a broad region?
I guess that either could work and could turn out with better options. I think my bias is probably toward the more market-oriented approach, but
so you believe it would produce the lowest costs for consumers, the market-based approach? Well,
one nuance here is I think that the RAP approach it's still a market. There's still, you can still procure from independent power producers. You can still trade between different entities. There's still market aspects there.
It's not centralized.
It's not centralized. And so then the question is, how much efficiency do you get from centralization and reducing transaction costs and whatnot? Versus leaving flexibility and room for innovation and more competition and things like that. And I guess I might not be entirely understanding all the trade-offs, but I tend to lean toward the market approach.
And so that's for the lower cost. But the second part was which one would more justly allocate costs?
Yeah, so I guess that there's two levels here. One is to justly allocating costs across retail customers within a specific state or utility territory, which I think the wholesale market should be indifferent to that, because it ought to be a state regulatory decision about the retail tariff design. the allocation of costs between different states and between different service territories is a little bit trickier. I'm getting into, really speculative territory here. So I don't know. I guess I'll just stick with I don't know and say a lot would depend on the state regulatory commissions.
Fair enough. That's why I call it an unfair question. Well, thank you, Jacob, for that. I'm curious to see where the Northwest or where the West goes. I actually don't believe necessarily that restructuring and going to a centralized market is going to be a slam dunk for us. I think we're going to lose a little bit in that process. And maybe we'll have the wrong objectives. But anyway, again, this is one of those time will tell.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you,
Sorry,
Ahlmahz, and
sorry,
thank
Paul.
you. Oh, that was great. No, don't apologize for being awesome.
Unfair is right in the name. You're supposed to. The question's supposed to be unfair.
Well, we're going to move on to our next segment where we close out the episode with a rundown of news stories we didn't get to in our TLDR segment we're calling Short to Ground. Public Power Underground is brought to you by NWPPA. The Northwest Public Power Association believes in the power of training and education. Every year, more than 6,500 public power employees learn and network at our classes, webinars, workshops, and conferences. NWPPA offers more than 250 events, wowzer, to choose from in areas such as leadership, engineering, operations, accounting, and finance, communications, and many more. Sometimes this very podcast, Public Power Underground, is broadcast live from one of our events. We call that being more powerful together. What will you learn this year? Find an event that's right for you at nwppa.org/catalog. That's nwppa.org/catalog. This is Short to Ground, a segment where we blow a fuse covering the news. I'm Paul Dockery.
And I'm Ahlmahz.
And we're
shorting to ground.
ground.
The Northwest needs to double its operating reserves to ensure it maintains resource adequacy during bad weather years, winter storms, and other events that can push the grid to its breaking point, according to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's last resource adequacy assessment. Find more coverage about the council's latest assessment by Dan Catchpole on Clearing Up.
Utilities, state water managers, and numerous agencies welcomed a pause in the conveyor belt of atmospheric rivers that has been pummeling the West Coast. The January 12th lull gave much needed time to regroup before more storms reached landfall as forecast. The storms left tens of thousands of utility customers without electricity. More than 20,000 people were evacuated, and dam operators were releasing water to help prevent flooding. Linda Daly Paulson has coverage of the topic in California energy markets.
Meanwhile, New York Times this morning headline, "The drought hasn't ended." Everybody's talking about how it still hasn't solved the problem so far as California is concerned, which I think is interesting.
Indeed.
Still drought conditions, but we're getting lots of rain.
All right. Compared to 2 years ago, the abundance of lower Columbia River coho adults improved to the making progress category of recovery, while Snake River steelhead adults dropped to the not keeping pace in Washington's 2022 State of the Salmon and Watersheds report. The other 12 species of Washington state salmonoids listed under the Endangered Species Act have not changed abundance category since the state's 2020 State of the Salmon report, according to a presentation on the report being completed by the governor's Salmon Recovery Office. Follow Clearing Up for more coverage by KC Mahaffey.
Retail customers on time of use rates are sticking with the program, and those with electric vehicles are significantly reducing demand at peak usage times, especially in hotter areas, investor-owned utilities told the California Public Utilities Commission this week. Leslie Willoughby, electric load analysis manager for San Diego Gas and Electric, said the utility saw a significant increase in customers switching EV charging to the super off-peak window and a concurrent decrease in charging during regular off-peak hours. You can find more coverage by Ann Ernst in California Energy Markets.
Pacific Gas and Electric and Swiss company Energy Vault on January 5th, announced a partnership to build and operate a utility scale battery plus green hydrogen long duration energy storage system in Calistoga, California. The facility, with a minimum of 293 megawatt hours of dispatchable carbon-free energy, is touted as the largest green hydrogen microgrid project in the United States. The proposal integrates a short duration battery system for grid forming and black start capabilities with long duration fuel cells, plus a green hydrogen storage system. For more, check out coverage by Yolanda Bluxham in California Energy Markets.
The Eugene Water and Electric Board approved a resolution on January 3rd directing its general manager to develop a plan to decommission the Leeburg hydroelectric project, according to a news release from the board. The project, which produced 11 average megawatts, was shut down in 2018 due to seismically vulnerable soils and erosion in parts of the Leeburg Canal. For more, check out Casey Mahaffey's coverage in Clearing Up, or we can ask Matt, because he used to work at EWEB. See what he has to say about it.
No comment.
Okay. Carnegie Mellon University, in collaboration with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, has supported research by Dr. Destiny Knopp, my favorite, to develop a national energy planning assessment model, or a people impact assessment model, that can identify how different power plant retirements will impact power emission distributions across the entire US, which can then be connected to local impacts. A link to a paper discussing the work co-authored by Tegan Goforth and Destiny Knopp is in the show notes, along with a short YouTube video highlighting the research. We have to get Destiny. We have to.
You think we can? Jacob, Professor Mays, do you know her? Can you get us in touch?
I know her. Yeah, you should totally have her on.
Okay.
So I think those are both phenomenal names, by the way. Destiny Knopp and Tegan Goforth.
It's great.
Yeah.
Also great work, you know. Great.
I don't even know what it's about. I want to read that.
You should. It was a great YouTube video. I watched it. Texas utility regulators plan to vote next week on whether to recommend the state adopt a controversial performance credit mechanism designed to ensure grid reliability during periods of low non-dispatchable power. The PCM has been criticized for its complexity, among other factors, and observers say it could take years to implement. Utility Dies has coverage of the topic by Robert Walton. Really excited to hear if you have any comments, Professor Mays, when we finish this out.
I mean, my career is about writing papers about obscure resource adequacy mechanisms, so this is great for me.
Rachel Dibble has been named the Vice President of Bulk Marketing at the Bonneville Power Administration effective January 15th, a position she held on an interim basis for the past year. She will oversee BPA's power trading floor, scheduling, pricing, market analysis, long-term surplus sales and purchases, and associated contract support and transaction settlement functions. Dibble has served in several management positions across the agency since joining BPA in 2008. Coverage of the news is in the brief mentions news roundup section of Clearing Up.
Form Energy, an iron air rechargeable battery startup, is building a new factory in Weirton, West Virginia. The $760 million project will occupy 55 acres of property and is planned to begin commercial operation in 2024. I think I messed project and property. I confused them as I was reading them, but you get the point. It's 55 acres, $750 million. The reverse rusting process used by Form Energy was developed by a team of researchers at MIT, and current estimates indicate the iron air batteries could cost a tenth of the cost of lithium ion batteries. One article quotes an estimate of $20 per kilowatt hour of capacity. For more, we found the topic on Energy Twitter. We'll share the tweet in the show notes, and thanks to Matthew Schroettnig for passing it along.
Matt, isn't Portland General also working with Form Energy as well, or am I thinking about somebody else? I thought there was somebody in the Northwest with this in the works as well.
A former Portland General executive went to work at Form Energy.
Well, there's that.
Maybe we can get her on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll have to think about that. Spot market power in the Northwest for delivery today, January 20th, is at $169 per megawatt hour, with Northwest gas at $14.53 per MMBTU, translating to a spark spread of $67.26 and a heat rate of 11,600. Spot power in the Southwest is at $125.25. Southern California at $133.72, and Northern California at $140.44. February gas at Henry Hub is at $3.28 per MMBTU.
Talk about price separation.
Yeah.
U.S. natural gas consumption reached its daily record high in December of 2022. While consumption of natural gas has surged, production fell rapidly, creating an imbalance that led to large withdrawals from storage and increased natural gas pipeline imports from Canada. Dry natural gas production in the lower 48 states fell from 98.6 BCF on December 21st to a low of 82.5 BCF on December 24th, a decline of 16.3%. Natural gas prices remain elevated in the West. Both West Coast Energy and Gas Transmission Northwest, pipelines that deliver natural gas into the Pacific Northwest from Canada at Sumas and Kingsgate, Idaho, respectively, reported curtailments on their system.
This week in NOAA climate forecasts, the 6 to 10 day outlook has below normal temperatures and below normal precipitation for the majority of the West. A new 90-day outlook was issued on January 19th. It is showing below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation for the northern latitudes and above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation for the southern portion of the West.
Lastly, checking Northwest water supply forecast, October through September flows at the Dalles for water year 2023 are currently forecast to be 78% of normal. That is below normal. That's 78% of normal. And April through September is at 82%. The ending elevation at Grand Coulee for January 19th was 1,281 feet, a 2-foot draw since January 8th recording. That's it for our TLDR segment. We may have to figure out how to make it shorter in the future. There's so many great articles to cover, though. Thanks to Public Power Underground's production partners at News Data for letting us use their leads. If you want to know more, you can find the complete stories in California energy markets and clearing up. Let's close it out, Ahlmahz. That's short to ground. I'll start with you, Professor Mays. Anything in there you wanted to talk about?
Well, I should, double down on the recommendation to talk to Destiny. She's been crushing it, and lots of great things to talk about from her group. I suppose with the performance capacity mechanism, I was kind of joking about it earlier, but I think getting back to the very beginning of the show, it's trying to solve the capacity problem. It's trying to that's a little bit unfair. It's trying to address the wrong problem, in the sense that it's sending more money to generators, but it's not facilitating risk sharing. It's not trying to manage that, and it's also actually weakening the incentive to perform relative to full strength energy only market prices, and so I think directionally it's the wrong way to go. So
when I had Professor Woloch on, he compared some of these mechanisms to tenure for a professor. So where you're just getting paid to show up, but not necessarily teach anything. Is that what they're doing in Texas? They're tenuring
it's
generators?
It's not quite like that, because it is attached to performance in critical times. But the problem is, if you spread what you define as a critical time too thin, then it's not actually directing compensation to the resources that are available in real system stress.
Okay.
So if you in Texas from 2014 to 2018, they never reached scarcity. There was never an issue. So if you give people performance payments in those 5 years, even though there were no times of system stress, you end up giving payments to resources that, who knows if they'd actually perform in a real system stress event. So the more you concentrate the payments into, when you actually really critically need it, the stronger an incentive it is to actually perform. And moving to something like the performance credit mechanism actually weakens that. It's not how I would do it.
Which is all the criticism I need. Like, it's not how Jacob Mays would do it, so let's not do it that way.
Well,
If
I know
only
you're-
that were enough for the PUC.
I know you're trying to wrap things up, but you just made me think of one quick question. Jacob, how do you feel about demand response? Like that's essentially paying for something that, it's a capacity payment. How do you feel about that?
Well, this is obviously another can of worms. The big problem with demand response as implemented is establishing the counterfactual of how much would you have consumed otherwise. And so this is another thing where I think putting things in a more formal financial terms would be better, because then if your demand and you've procured in advance a certain amount and then you use less than that, then you get paid the balance at the spot price, and that's or the contractually agreed price. And you have your contracted quantity and you have your actual consumption, and there's no need to establish a baseline. It's just a normal contract. So I think that's something that would be better if it were in a more formal financial framework.
All right, I'm going to stop.
I love it.
I'm going to stop.
I'm not cutting any of this out. This is going to be our longest episode. If anybody gets here, you get a gold star. Thank you for coming.
My follow-up is kind of twofold. One, with respect to your comments a moment ago about the PCM, I'm curious if you would, how important is it to get that capacity pricing or the incentive correct? Conversely, would it be easier simply to force forfeit of, an extended period of time's worth of the capacity credit you got should you fail to perform? And the other question I had was from the very beginning of the conversation, and it's somewhat related in the sense that considering resource adequacy and capacity and the concept of resource adequacy and the reliability component of it, how do you differentiate between those two things and dispatchability? And the demand response comment had me biting my tongue because it's capacity, but it's not dispatchable. And so considering those three things, how do you differentiate between the three?
Well, I think so maybe I'll take a little bit of a different definition on dispatchability and say, in principle, an energy-only market, you don't need to make any evaluation in advance on how something will perform. You just see how the system performs, you set efficient prices, and then you compensate people accordingly. And then so if somebody, regardless of whether you dispatched it or it did it of its own volition, if they reduce their consumption, then they get compensated for that. And there's going to be nuances and intricacies in terms of, did we dispatch the system slightly incorrectly because there's a lag between the solution of the economic dispatch and the actual operation system, and we're solving for 5-minute periods. There's going to be nuances there that aren't completely captured, but I think to first order, you get a more or less accurate valuation and compensation for different resources. So to tie this back to the distinction between capacity and resource adequacy, clearly when you model the situation, or when you model and simulate the system, you can run into situations where you have a ramping constraint or a transmission constraint or a uncertainty that's causing you to hold back water in your reservoir or stored charge in your battery or things like that, that change the actual operation of the system relative to the evaluation that you would make in a capacity accreditation. And all of this bluntness that's in capacity accreditation relative to real world operations gives an opportunity for a mismatch between resource adequacy, which is being able to deliver energy to the right time at the right time to the right place in the grid, versus capacity accreditation, which is much blunter and kind of leaves out a lot of the operational detail. And so dispatchability kind of ties into that, where there's all of these operational constraints that show up in the real world, but don't show up in capacity accreditation models that give rise to disconnects between what capacity you have and whether that's actually adequacy.
I think that really helped me, like from the beginning of this episode where I was confused and got capacity and resource adequacy, and slowly I've kind of learned through the episode, and I think that kind of did a nice little period at the end where I think it makes a bunch of more sense to me, the distinctions between capacity and resource
I should have led
adequacy.
with that then.
No, I had to have the beginning. I had to go on the journey with you, and we've gone on a journey. Matt, I did want to give you the opportunity. Were there any articles in the TLDR segment you wanted to talk about?
Form energy is super exciting. The idea of derusting as a battery makes a heck of a lot more sense to me than Bitcoin as a battery. Let's not go into that. The idea that we're talking 3 megawatts an acre, was that that final number?
Yeah, they made it sound like that was good, but that seemed bad. That's a lot of land.
Because that seems like a big footprint for 3 megawatts.
And I don't know how you come to that.
And especially given the kilowatt cost, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I'm super excited about the technology. I think we all have a ton of respect for the people we know who are involved in the project. I know I do anyway. And so it'll be fun. But that one that stuck out for me, and so I'm really interested and excited to learn more about it.
And I haven't seen discussions about like what their dispatch curve is. Like, what is your ramp rate? How much can you actually flow in or flow out?
They put some qualifiers out there saying, they're not able to respond as quickly as lithium ion, which,
right.
I mean, we're talking about rust. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm really curious about like ramp rate stuff and how responsive it can be and how long a duration can you store. Which is probably the thing it's best at, right? As described, the thing it's best at is saving energy for a long time.
So it'll be time shifting, hopefully seasonal,
I think that's what it's targeting.
Not just diurnal,
really yeah. Anything you wanted to follow up on, Ahlmahz?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you for doing this. This was so much fun. We ran a little bit over time. This is going to be a super long episode, like I said. But wonderful job, Professor Mays. I hope you feel valued and appreciated.
Absolutely.
This was a great conversation as far as I was concerned. I enjoyed every minute of it. Matt, thank you for coming back and joining us. Do you feel valued and appreciated?
Very much so. Very happy to be back, and it was great to make your acquaintance, Professor Mays. Thank you once again. And to finally do an episode with you, Ahlmahz. I've listened to plenty, but I've yet to have the pleasure myself. So thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Ahlmahz, for doing the insightful question and for being a participant and a co-host. So thank you, Ahlmahz. Do you feel valued and appreciated?
I do, and thank you, Jacob, for being a good sport with the unscripted question that just randomly crosses my head.
Best part of every episode. Public Power Underground is the power industry's premier infotainment program that covers electric utility and electric utility adjacent news from a power department's perspective. You can sign up for an unintrusive newsletter with links to ways to consume all this fascinating content at publicpowerunderground.substack.com. Thanks to Northwest Requirement Utilities and our co-star Matt. Northwest Requirement Utilities advocates on behalf of its members for cost-effective and reliable wholesale power supply and transmission service, including transfer service from Bonneville Power Administration. It also educates and informs members about BPA and other regional power supply and transmission issues. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.
No, we aren't perfect. Sometimes it's a bust, but we'll roll on, enthusiasts, roll on.
Public Power Underground is a production of Seattle City Light and News Data. The views expressed to your own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, Northwest Requirements Utilities, News Data, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. Public Power Underground is electric utility and electric utility adjacent news from a power department's perspective. Today's episode was written by Paul Dockery, Ahlmahz Negash, and Matthew Schroettnig, and it's edited and published by the stellar team at Pioneer Utility Resources, led by associate producer Sarah Wooten, with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiast, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. That's all for this week. Thanks for tuning in.